I'm Clara Monroe. I was 19 when I learned that grief isn't always the loudest emotion in the room. Sometimes it's betrayal. My mother had just died, and instead of mourning, my father and his new wife tried to erase everything she left behind, including me. What they didn't expect was that her final gift would set off a war. Before I dive in, let me know where you're watching this video from in the comments. I love seeing where our stories travel. It should have been a somber day. The marble walls of the law office in downtown New Orleans practically hummed with silence, broken only by the steady tick of an antique clock and the careful flipping of legal pages. I sat on the far end of a long, polished oak table, feet barely touching the floor, fingers gripping the edge of my chair like I might fall off if I let go. Clara Monroe, age 19, only biological child of the deceased, the lawyer began, his voice flat, almost bored. Like reading the will of my mother, Janine Monroe, was just another line item on his day. My father, Richard, sat across from me. Next to him, with a pearl necklace tight around her throat and lips pursed like she'd swallowed a lemon, was Marlene, his new wife of barely 2 years. The ink on their wedding license had dried faster than my mother's last hospital bill. Marlene had always been the kind of woman who treated empathy like it was optional. And today, she hadn't even bothered to pretend. Her red nails tapped impatiently on the table as if she had dinner reservations to get to. Meanwhile, Richard kept glancing at his Rolex, the one he bought after Mom's funeral, as if grief was something you could time, then move on from. But I wasn't going anywhere, and neither was the will. The lawyer adjusted his glasses and read aloud. All physical property and remaining estate, including the family home in the Garden District, life insurance disbursements, and personal savings accounts, are to be left solely to Clara Monroe for the purposes of education and cost of living. The pause that followed was longer than any breath I'd taken since she died. Marlene gasped, audibly. Richard's face turned a shade of red I hadn't seen since he missed his tea time and blamed me for not reminding him. I sat perfectly still, though I could feel my heart slamming against my ribs. "Excuse me." Marlene leaned forward like she hadn't heard correctly. The lawyer, unbothered, continued. "There is a clause, handwritten by Janine Monroe 2 weeks prior to her passing, reaffirming her intent. It specifies that no part of the estate is to be transferred, shared, or co-managed by Richard Monroe or his spouse." Marlene looked like someone had just thrown a glass of cold water in her face. "This must be a mistake." "It's notarized," the lawyer replied. "Legally binding." I didn't say a word. I couldn't. My throat was tight, but not from sadness, from disbelief. My mother had done this. She had planned for this. She knew. Richard finally spoke, his voice low but sharp. "This isn't what we discussed." "What you discussed, maybe." With her barely able to speak, with morphine in her bloodstream. I looked at him then, not with anger, not yet, with something quieter, a question he couldn't answer. "How could you try to steal what she left for me?" Marlene turned to me with a smile so thin it might have cracked if I blinked wrong. "Well, sweetie, now that you're flush," she said, stressing the word like it had a bad taste, "I'm sure we can work out something that benefits everyone." The lawyer cleared his throat. "This is not a negotiation. The will is final." They hadn't expected this. Not from her, not for me. The rest of the meeting blurred. More legal terms, copies to sign. A folder placed in front of me like it was a prize I hadn't earned. But I felt the tide shift in that room, just a little. Enough for me to know I'd have to fight to keep what was mine. And I would. The keys felt heavier than I remembered. I stood outside the Garden District house I grew up in, staring at the flaking paint on the wraparound porch and the wrought iron fence that had once been my jungle gym. New Orleans humidity clung to my skin, thick and soupy, as if the air itself knew the weight of what I was about to step into. This house had always belonged to my mother in every way that mattered. The lilac bushes she planted still lined the walkway, overgrown now but stubborn in their bloom. I didn't know how to feel about inheriting it. Not yet. All I knew was that I had to go inside. The front door creaked, same as it always had. Inside, dust hung like fog in the slanted sunlight, catching on old picture frames and the edge of the bookshelf that still held worn paperbacks and college catalogs. Mom had kept everything organized but lived in. Home wasn't a showroom to her. It was a place to read and dream, a place for me to grow. I set my bag down in the hallway and wandered into the living room. Her scent lingered in the air, faint but distinct. Lavender and ink. She used to say bookstores had the best smell in the world, paper and possibility. I ran my hand along the edge of her desk. The same one where she spent late nights balancing bookstore invoices and writing little notes to herself on sticky pads in a loopy cursive I had always envied. In the corner of the desk drawer, tucked beneath a paperweight shaped like a cat wearing glasses, I found a stack of her old letters. Not addressed to anyone, just entries, musings, thoughts that never made it into conversation. Clara needs space to dream. I need to make sure the world doesn't crowd her too soon. My throat tightened. My mother hadn't just left me this house. She'd left me intent, a decision, proof that she knew even in her last days that the people around us couldn't be trusted with my future. I sank onto the floral sofa, her favorite, and for the first time in weeks allowed myself to just sit. Not plan, not argue, just sit. The clock ticked from the mantel. That old antique had chimed at every birthday, every New Year's, every late-night thunderstorm when we'd stayed up drinking cocoa and whispering about what we'd do when things got better. Now I was here. And she was. But Richard was. And so was Marlene, living just a few streets over in their sleek townhouse with granite countertops and ice-cold stairs. I could still hear Marlene's voice in my head from the law office. Now that you're flush. Like she already had a spreadsheet for how to siphon me dry. I shook the thought away. I wasn't here to stew in their ambition. I was here to remember who taught me how to stand tall. In the kitchen, I found the tiny recipe box Mom used to guard like it was treasure. Inside were index cards with splatters of sauce and flour smudges from a decade of Sunday mornings. Her handwriting danced across everyone. I could hear her voice reading them aloud, mocking the fancy cookbook tone with dramatic flair. Add 1 egg unless your cousin is visiting, then double it and hide the last slice before she gets there. I laughed through my tears. That was the woman who raised me. Practical, kind, fierce in her own quiet way. She didn't believe in yelling, she believed in decisions, in silence that meant something. And that silence spoke volumes now. This house wasn't just a house. It was my evidence, my anchor, my mother's last chess move in a game she knew was coming. I looked around at the walls, the stacked boxes, the untouched corners. It would take time to sort through it all. But every book, every receipt, every scuff on the floor told the story of someone who had sacrificed comfort for truth. This was my battlefield now, and I intended to fight like her. The kitchen had always been too bright in the mornings. The sunlight streamed through the lace curtains Mom had sewn herself, casting little floral shadows across the checkered tile. It used to feel cozy. Now it felt staged, like a set where everyone had memorized their lines, and I was the only one stumbling through the script. Marlene was already sitting at the breakfast nook when I came downstairs, flipping through a glossy home decor magazine and sipping something with almond milk she always claimed was better for the skin. She smiled the moment she saw me, but it didn't touch her eyes. "Morning, sweet pea," she chirped. "Sleep okay?" I muttered something close to fine and walked past her toward the coffee pot. My fingers had just closed around the handle when I heard my father's voice behind me. "You're up early," Richard said casually, like we hadn't nearly gone to legal war 2 days ago. He moved to the cupboard, retrieved his favorite mug, the one I had given Mom on their 20th anniversary, back when I still believed in fairy tales, and poured himself a cup. Marlene set her magazine down with a sigh. "We were just saying how proud we are of you, Clara. Handling all this grown-up responsibility so gracefully. Your mom would be so proud." There it was. That familiar sting behind her sugar-sweet tone. She always weaponized sentiment like a pastry served warm but meant to choke you. I took a slow sip of coffee. "Thanks." Richard leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "Listen, kiddo, I know all this legal stuff is a lot to process, and I'm sure your mom had her reasons, but the truth is, things are tight right now. Real tight." He said it like it was a secret, like I wasn't already aware of the disappearing luxury SUV or the sudden sale of their condo in Florida last fall. Marlene nodded dramatically. "We've had to make sacrifices, too, but we're a family and families help each other, right?" I didn't answer. I just watched as my father took another sip of coffee and waited, like he thought I'd jump in with an offer. When I didn't, he pressed on. "We're not asking for much, Clara. Just a little help with the utilities this month. Maybe the property tax on the house. Now that you're comfortable, it just makes sense to pool resources." I set my mug down carefully. "I thought the house wasn't in your name." Silence, just for a beat. "Well, technically, no," Richard admitted, clearing his throat. "But I mean, we've all lived there. It's sentimental." Marlene reached across the table, resting her manicured fingers on mine. "And it's not about money, sweetheart. It's about sharing. You're not alone anymore. We're here. Let us be part of this next chapter." I smiled, but it didn't reach my heart. "I'll think about it." Their smiles stretched wider, too wide, like they just closed a deal. But inside, I felt the walls of the kitchen begin to shrink. The room that once smelled like cinnamon rolls and ink-stained books now reeked of carefully constructed traps. They thought I was naive. They thought "I'll think about it" meant maybe. What it really meant, I'd seen the opening move. And I knew exactly what game they were playing. It arrived in a plain envelope with no return address. I almost didn't open it. I assumed it was another legal notice, another thinly veiled attempt by Richard or Marlene to clarify something that didn't need clarification. But inside was something different. A letter, yellowed slightly at the edges, on the letterhead of Rouso and Trent Accounting Services. And at the bottom, a signature I recognized instantly. Douglas Baird. Mr. Baird was my mother's old accountant. A quiet man with thick glasses and a fondness for chamomile tea. I remembered him from childhood tax seasons, when he'd come to the bookstore with his briefcase and cookies he swore were low sugar, but never actually were. The letter was short, direct, but what it said made my fingers tremble. "Dear Clara, I know this may be an emotionally difficult time, but your mother asked me to ensure that certain documents reach you directly in the event of her passing. She instructed that this envelope be mailed once the estate proceedings began. Enclosed is documentation of a savings account funded from the sale of the bookstore last year. Your mother designated it explicitly for your tuition and living expenses. No one else has legal access to these funds. If you need help understanding or securing this account, please contact me directly. My card is enclosed." Warmly, Douglas Baird. I read the letter 3 times before I noticed the second slip of paper, a bank statement. My name, a 5-digit balance, and one very clear note written in my mother's handwriting across the top. For Clara's future, not theirs. I didn't know whether to laugh or cry. Maybe both. All this time, I'd assumed the bookstore had barely broken even, that the sale was just a way to ease the final months of medical bills. But Mom had planned further ahead. She'd carved out this little haven of protection in a world full of people who were only looking out for themselves. And now it was my move. I left the house with the envelope clutched in my bag and walked straight to the bank, the same one I used in high school. The manager, a middle-aged man with kind eyes and a cautious tone, reviewed the paperwork. "I remember your mother," he said softly, tapping the signature line. "She was always meticulous, never missed a decimal." He verified the account, cross-checked the access restrictions, and added my name officially to the file. "You're the sole beneficiary," he confirmed. "This was hers, now it's yours." The moment he said it, something shifted inside me. All the days I'd spent second-guessing myself. All the moments I'd felt like I was one misstep away from losing everything. Suddenly I realized I wasn't walking blind through this storm. I had her compass. That night I walked back into the Garden District house with a new kind of calm. Richard was in the living room, reading the newspaper with performative focus, and Marlene was rearranging a vase of fake orchids like they were her own memories to curate. I held up the envelope. "We need to talk." Richard looked up slowly. About this," I said, placing the bank statement on the coffee table. "It's a separate account, tied to the bookstore sale, designated for my education." Marlene's hand froze midair. Richard's jaw tensed. "Clara, that was just a business liquidation. Any assets from that sale went into the estate." "No," I interrupted calmly. "It was separate, set up by Mr. Baird, legally earmarked. She signed it months before she passed. You don't have access. You never did." Richard leaned back in his chair, trying to regain composure. "You don't understand how finances work." I understand enough to know when someone's trying to lie to my face. Marlene finally spoke. There's no need to be hostile. We're all family here. I looked her straight in the eye. No, we're not. And I left the room quietly without slamming doors because real power doesn't shout. It simply knows. Dinner was a performance, and I wasn't playing my part. The dining room table looked like something out of a magazine. Candles lit, napkins folded into triangles, Marlene's signature rosemary pot roast front and center like it hadn't come from a grocery kit she'd reheated in secret. She always needed things to look like effort, never mind the actual substance. Richard sat at the head of the table, carving meat with a precision that felt rehearsed. "Hope you're hungry," he said, trying to sound cheerful. "We made plenty." We. As if he'd done more than open a bottle of wine and light the candles. I took my seat slowly, watching both of them for any hint of a shift. It was too quiet, too controlled. The calm after a storm, except I knew another was coming. Marlene passed me a basket of rolls, smiling. "You know, sweetie," she began, buttering one herself, "I had a little idea this morning, just a small thing that could help all of us. Here we go." She leaned in slightly, her voice lowering like she was sharing a family secret. "The house, you know, the one you inherited, needs a few repairs. Nothing major, just foundation work. Plumbing, a roof redo, maybe." Richard nodded solemnly like he'd personally climbed into the crawlspace to check. "The inspector said it was overdue." Inspector, there hadn't been one. "And we were thinking," Marlene continued, "instead of using your tuition account, which of course is for school, you could take out a little home repair loan, just enough to cover the basics." Richard added, "And if you want, we could co-sign, keep it in the family." I placed my fork down carefully. "Co-sign? Only to help with approval, honey," Marlene said with a bright tone. "You're still so young after all, the bank might not take you seriously on your own." I forced a smile. "And this loan would be in my name?" "Technically, yes," she said quickly. "But we'd all benefit. I mean, we're living there too." My stomach tightened. Not from the food, but from the pressure, the way they'd wrapped manipulation in a linen napkin and served it with wine. "I appreciate the suggestion," I said slowly, "but I'm not comfortable with that." Richard stiffened. "It's just a formality, Clara. You'd still have full control." "Then why do you need your names on it?" Silence. Marlene cleared her throat, laughing softly like I'd told a silly joke. "You don't have to make it sound so dramatic. We're just trying to support each other here." I met her gaze. "By going into debt for a house I already own." The air grew heavy. The roast steamed untouched. Richard leaned forward, his voice lower now. "You know, you're starting to sound a lot like your mother, suspicious, guarded." I stared at him, something cold settling in my chest. Maybe that's because she knew something I didn't until now. Another beat of silence. Marlene picked at her salad. Richard reached for his wine. I didn't need a lawyer in the room to understand what they were doing. They were testing the waters, seeing how far I'd bend before I broke. But I wasn't bending. Not this time. I stood, my napkin falling to the chair. "I'm not co-signing anything, not now, not ever." Neither of them moved. "Dinner was lovely," I added, walking to the door. "Next time, just send an email with the pitch." And then I left the room, my footsteps echoing down the hallway as I made my silent exit, one step closer to understanding just how deep their game went. My mother's sister, Aunt Vivian, lived in a shotgun house just a few blocks away, but stepping inside felt like crossing into a different world. No crystal wine glasses, no curated centerpieces, just a pitcher of sweet tea sweating on the porch table and a breeze rolling through the rustling magnolia trees. It smelled like old wood and fresh lemons. It smelled like home. She didn't ask why I came. She just opened the door, handed me a glass, and gestured for me to sit in the faded wicker chair beside her. For a moment, neither of us spoke. We just listened to the hum of cicadas, the low rumble of a neighbor's lawnmower, and the sound of two people trying to find a place where truth could land softly. Vivian was my mother's older sister by 8 years. She had Mom's same eyes, soft but observant, and the kind of patience that made you forget you were being studied until you'd already said too much. "I heard there was a storm brewing over at Richard's place," she said eventually, sipping her tea. I nodded. "It's more like a quiet war." Her lips twitched into something that wasn't quite a smile. I imagine it is. Your mama saw it coming. That's why she planned the way she did. She never told me, I said, barely above a whisper. Not directly. She didn't want to put that weight on you before she had to. She figured life would do it soon enough. I swallowed hard. I got a letter from her accountant, I said, about a separate account for my tuition, and now they're asking me to co-sign loans, help with bills, act like this is some group project. Vivian's eyes darkened, not with surprise but recognition. Your daddy has always been good at painting things as shared responsibility, especially when it lets him escape his own. He's charming when he wants to be, I muttered. Vivian leaned back, the chair creaking. That charm's covered a lot of ugly over the years. You were too young to know this, but after our daddy, your grandfather, passed, Richard tried to tamper with the will. My head snapped toward her. He got caught, she continued. Forged a document, claimed he was supposed to inherit the workshop in Shreveport, but Dad had left that to me. Your mama caught the discrepancy and shut it down before it got to court. I stared at her. He tried to forge legal papers. Vivian nodded once, her expression grim. He's always hated the idea of women having anything he couldn't control. Your mother knew that. It's why she was meticulous in her planning, why she made sure that house and those funds had your name on them, only yours. I exhaled shakily. The puzzle pieces were falling into place, and none of them were pretty. I thought I was being paranoid, I admitted. Like maybe I was too suspicious, too guarded. Vivian looked at me with steady, knowing eyes. That's what people like Richard want you to believe, that protecting yourself is an attack. We sat in silence again. She refilled my glass without asking, the way only someone who loves you does. Clara, she said quietly, you don't owe anyone your peace of mind just because they share your blood. I looked down at my lap. The condensation from the glass made a dark ring on my jeans. Do you think they'll try something? I asked. Vivian nodded slowly. Not think, no. And when they do, don't meet them with fear, meet them with facts. She stood, went inside, and returned a moment later with a dusty folder. Start documenting everything, she said, handing it to me. Phone calls, texts, letters, even the tone of their voice if it changes. You're not just protecting what your mama left you, you're protecting yourself. I took the folder, heart heavy but steady. Vivian reached out and squeezed my hand. And Clara, don't wait too long to fight back. They're counting on your silence. The next morning, Richard was all smiles. He stood in the foyer with a casual air, like a man who just returned from a pleasant jog, not someone quietly plotting to dismantle his daughter's legal protection. Hey, kiddo, he said, keys jingling in his hand. We've got an appointment with a lawyer this afternoon. Shouldn't take long, just some clarification stuff, paperwork cleanup, really. I blinked. A lawyer. New guy, just making sure everything's aligned. You know, no loose ends. I didn't move. I already have a lawyer, the estate's finalized. Richard laughed like I'd said something cute. No need to be defensive, this isn't about contesting anything, it's just formality, dotting I's, crossing T's. Marlene appeared at the top of the stairs, wearing pearls and perfume that tried too hard. We thought it might be helpful, she called down. Just a second pair of eyes, for your sake. My stomach tightened. They were dressing it up in concern. It smelled like strategy. I forced a neutral expression. What firm? Richard shrugged. Independent guy, Mr. Gaines, old friend of a colleague. Marlene added. He's wonderful, very efficient, and discreet. Discreet, of course. That's what people like them valued most, not truth, not fairness, discretion. I looked between them, my mind racing. I couldn't say no outright, not without tipping them off that I was preparing. But I couldn't go in blind either, so I nodded slowly. Okay, sure. I'll come. Richard clapped his hands once. That's my girl. My girl. That phrase, once sweet, now sounded like a rope he was trying to toss around my neck. The rest of the day moved in slow motion. I returned to my room, the one that used to be mine in a different life, and turned it into my own war room. Vivian's folder lay open on the bed. I began adding my own records, printed emails, copies of the will, notes from every strange conversation we'd had since the reading. I called Vivian again, but it went to voicemail. I paced the floor, stared out the window at the gnarled oak trees that lined our street. My heart was thudding in my chest, not from fear exactly, but from the pressure of knowing I had to walk into that office like I believed every word they said. Just long enough to figure out what they were really planning. because they weren't just looking to clarify anything. They were looking to reclaim what they thought they lost. I was no longer just the girl in the will. I was the obstacle, and they were dressing up deception in suits and legalese. The law office was too cold, not just in temperature, but in atmosphere, in tone, in the sterile way everything gleamed like no real emotion had ever lived here. The leather chairs squeaked slightly under pressure, the carpet muffled steps, and the receptionist never looked anyone directly in the eye. Mr. Gaines' name was stenciled on the frosted door in sleek, unassuming serif, the kind of font that wanted to be trusted. Richard opened the door with a hand on my back, as if guiding me in like a helpful father, but it felt more like a shepherd walking a lamb toward the fence. "Clara, this is Mr. Gaines," he said, gesturing toward a man in a steel-gray suit, slicked hair, and a half-smile that looked like it had been sewn on for courtrooms and sales calls. "Pleasure," Mr. Gaines said smoothly, offering a hand I didn't shake. "Likewise," I murmured, taking the seat farthest from the door. Marlene settled in beside me, too close, her perfume thick and cloying. Richard took the chair beside Mr. Gaines like he was the one paying for the hour. And maybe, in some way, he was. Mr. Gaines folded his hands. "We won't take up too much of your time, Clara. We're simply here to ensure that everything your mother intended is being followed. Sometimes we'll leave out clarifying details. Emotional moments make for hasty language." "She was quite specific," I replied. "Yes, yes," he nodded, reaching into a folder. "And yet there are always ways to make things smoother for everyone." He pulled out a document, thick, double-spaced, with lots of bold words I didn't like. "What is this?" I asked, scanning the top line. "A clarifying agreement," he said gently. "Not a modification, just an acknowledgement that the property and financials are being shared and managed responsibly. As a family." He pushed a pen toward me like it was a casual suggestion. I didn't move. Richard leaned in, voice low and fatherly. "It just formalizes what we've already been doing, Clara. Making decisions together, living as a unit. It protects you too." Marlene chimed in, soft as a lullaby. "We thought it might give you peace of mind." I looked down at the document again. My name was on every page, not theirs. But something else struck me. There were blank fields for initials beside financial terms I didn't recognize. Clauses referencing co-ownership. Shared debt assumption, liquidation options. This wasn't a clarifying agreement. This was a transfer, a slow erasure. I pushed the papers back gently. "I'd like to take this home and review it." Mr. Gaines' smile flickered, just for a second. "Of course, but the language is very straightforward. You don't want to give the impression you're doubting your father's intentions." Richard gave a soft chuckle. "You trust us, don't you?" I met his eyes, and for the first time I didn't see my father. I saw a man who viewed my trust as a tool. I stood. "I'm not signing anything today." "Clara," Marlene said sweetly, "don't be dramatic." "I'm not," I said, gathering my bag. "I'm being careful." Mr. Gaines stood too, adjusting his cufflinks. "Well, you're certainly within your rights, but keep in mind waiting too long can complicate family dynamics." His words were soft, but the warning was clear. As I walked toward the door, I felt it. A shift in the room, like something had cracked. Like the pleasantries were running out. Richard stood abruptly. "Clara!" But I didn't turn around. I walked out of that office with the agreement in my bag and my pulse thudding in my ears. By the time I hit the street, the sun was too bright, the sky too loud. My body felt like it was moving underwater. I ducked into the nearest cafe, locked myself in the bathroom stall, and sat there for 10 minutes, breathing. I had been so close to signing, just to make the pressure stop. Just to go home and pretend this wasn't happening. But I didn't, and that meant everything. The silence in the bathroom stall was the loudest thing I'd heard all day. My hands were shaking, not out of fear, but out of the adrenaline crash that comes when you've just avoided a trap by inches. I held the agreement in my lap like it might bite. The longer I stared at the paper, the more sinister it looked. Legalese dressed up as concern, financial terms posing as love. I pulled out my phone and tried calling Aunt Vivian again. No signal, of course. I took a deep breath, tried again, still nothing. The bathroom suddenly felt smaller. The soft hum of the cafe beyond the door was muffled, distant, like I wasn't entirely in my body. I pressed my palm flat against the stall wall to steady myself, grounding my thoughts. What if I had signed? Would they have told me I just handed over rights to the house, to the savings? Would they have mentioned the debt clauses? The fact that the minute my name touched that paper, they could start shifting funds in and out without my permission. I unzipped my bag and took out a pen. Not to sign, to underline. I began circling phrases, scribbling questions in the margins. Anything I didn't understand got a red star. Anything that felt slippery got two. I'd learned from my mother that when you don't know something, don't fake it. Document it. Learn it. Prepare. A few minutes later, I heard footsteps outside the stall, slow, measured. Someone cleared their throat. Then silence. I didn't move. Were they waiting for me, or was it just a customer? Then a whisper, low, too low to hear words, but definitely there. I froze, hand mid-sentence on the margin. Another voice closer to the door now. Don't think she'll, and then nothing. I waited. Breath shallow. My pulse ticked like a clock in my ears. A soft click, the bathroom door opening again, then closing. I waited another full minute before I dared move. When I stepped out, the bathroom was empty. But something had shifted. I could feel it. That hum behind your ears when something isn't quite right. I washed my hands slowly, watching the mirror. My reflection stared back, too still. The hallway outside the restroom was quiet. The receptionist at the front desk was gone. I turned toward Mr. Gaines' office. The door was slightly ajar now. As I passed, I caught sight of something strange. Richard. Standing inside, his back to me, hands up. Mr. Gaines was at the far end of the room, head lowered. And then Marlene sitting in the chair I just occupied, her face blotchy, mascara smudged. She was crying, not crocodile tears, real tears. Before I could process it, I heard a voice sharp, commanding. Step aside, federal investigation, put your hands where we can see them. I froze in place. Men in navy jackets flooded into the office, their movements swift, practiced. FBI, FBI. One of them reached for a folder on the table. Another pulled out handcuffs. Ma'am, please move back, a female agent said, gently placing a hand on my shoulder and guiding me away from the chaos. I stumbled back, still clutching the agreement in my hands. My breath caught. My heart tried to catch up. The last thing I saw before they closed the office door was Richard, my father, being read his rights. I don't remember walking out of that building. I remember the feeling, the disorientation, like I'd stepped through a door expecting a conversation and walked straight into a collapse. Like the floor hadn't disappeared exactly, but had shifted into something entirely unfamiliar beneath me. Outside, the air was hot and wet, but I couldn't feel it. I stood on the sidewalk across from Mr. Gaines' office, clutching the unsigned agreement, watching as agents moved in and out of the building like it was just another Thursday. As if taking down a scheme hidden in grief was part of the job. And maybe it was. Someone handed me a bottle of water, I don't remember who. My mind was stuck, looping the image of Marlene's face, red and tear-streaked, and Richard, looking like he'd just lost a game he thought he'd already won. A young agent approached me cautiously. Clara Monroe, I nodded. He held out a badge. I'm Agent Rowan. I'd like to ask you a few questions. I followed him to the curb where an unmarked car was parked in the shade of an oak tree. Not the back seat, not a holding cell, just the sidewalk. Like they were being careful not to frighten me more than necessary. First off, he said, you're not in any trouble. We just need to clarify a few things. Clarify. That word again. Only this time it didn't feel like manipulation. It felt like something new, truth trying to break the surface. How long have you known about the financial accounts tied to your mother's estate? He asked. I got a letter, a week ago, I said, from her accountant, Douglas Baird. He nodded, made a note. Did you know anyone was attempting to access those funds? I swallowed. I had suspicions, but I didn't have proof, not until today. Agent Rowan turned his clipboard around and showed me a printed document. My name, but it wasn't my handwriting. It was a transfer request, a forged signature. Clear as daylight. Mr. Gaines was facilitating fraudulent asset transfers, Rowan explained. We've been investigating him for months, but we didn't have a link to the Monroe estate until a whistleblower submitted a tip 2 days ago. My breath caught. A tip? He smiled, just slightly. Your aunt, Vivian Monroe. A tear slipped down my cheek before I even felt it. She gave us copies of your mother's financial protections, backups of the original will, and flagged suspicious behavior from your father going back decades. I pressed my hand to my mouth. It was too much, and yet not enough. She protected me, I whispered. Rowan nodded. And now it's your turn. He handed me a copy of the forged document. Would you be willing to submit a statement? We believe you're listed as a party on other falsified forms as well. I took the paper with steady hands. Yes, I'll do whatever it takes. Behind us, agents escorted Richard and Marlene to a black SUV. He didn't look at me, but she did, just once. And in her eyes was something I hadn't expected, not hatred, not anger, but disbelief. As if even now she couldn't understand how their plan had crumbled. As if I wasn't supposed to fight back. As if grief was supposed to make me pliable. But they didn't count on love doing something else. They didn't count on my mother's voice still living in my head, in her records, in the careful way she had prepared for every contingency. They didn't count on Vivian watching quietly from the sidelines, waiting for the right moment to step in. And they didn't count on me saying no, over and over again until the law listened. They processed him in silence. Richard, my father, the man who taught me how to ride a bike, who cheered from the bleachers at my middle school spelling bees, now sitting in a bulletproof van with his wrists cuffed in front of him like some character in a courtroom drama. But this wasn't TV. This was real. I stood across the street from the law office, arms crossed tightly around myself, watching everything through a glassy filter of disbelief. Marlene was the last to be let out. She didn't resist, didn't cry again. Her posture was stiff, her mouth tight like she was bracing for impact. I wasn't sure whether to pity her or to wonder how far she'd helped him scheme. When the SUV pulled away, sirens silent, I finally exhaled. It wasn't triumph, not yet, but it was a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding since my mother died. Agent Rowan returned a few minutes later. They'll be held overnight, bail hearings in the morning. You won't have to be there unless you choose to be. I nodded, my voice slow. Will they be charged with fraud? Forgery, conspiracy to defraud an estate, attempted misappropriation of restricted funds, and potentially obstruction, depending on how cooperative Mr. Gaines is from here on out. He paused, then added, They won't get away with it, Clara. It didn't feel like victory, just relief, heavy and slow. I spent the rest of the day answering questions, giving my official statement, handing over copies of the forged documents, emails, letters, even the text Marlene had sent 2 nights ago asking if I'd thought more about our little family loan. That text now sat on Agent Rowan's evidence list under implied coercion. By the time I left the federal office building, the sky was already turning pink. The street lamps were humming. I hadn't eaten since breakfast, but the idea of food turned my stomach. I walked home instead of calling a car. It took almost an hour, and I didn't listen to music. I needed the silence. I needed to hear my own footsteps, feel the rhythm of the pavement beneath me, and remind myself that this body, this life, was still mine. The house on Prytania Street looked different in the twilight. Less like a battlefield, more like a monument. I stepped onto the porch and unlocked the door with the same brass key I'd used since I was 12. The air inside was still, not stale, just paused, like it had been waiting for this moment. For me to come back not as the daughter or the dependent or the girl wrapped in grief, but as the heir, the survivor, the one who stayed standing. In the living room, the old clock ticked gently. The mail was still stacked neatly on the table. A flyer for a roofing company lay beside a grocery receipt and a scribbled sticky note from myself that read, Call Vivian, don't forget. I reached for my phone again. This time it rang. Clara. Vivian's voice was breathless. Are you okay? I smiled despite myself. They're gone. Oh, honey, I saw them in cuffs, I whispered, blinking hard. You warned me, you were right. You were right, too, she said firmly. You trusted your gut. You didn't give in. Your mother would be Clara. She'd be so proud. Tears slid silently down my face, but not from sadness, from something else, vindication. Thank you, I said, for sending the tip, for stepping in when I couldn't see it all clearly. Vivian exhaled into the phone, long and slow. I promised your mother I'd protect you if things went south. She was worried they would. I didn't want to believe it. But when I saw that document Marlene left on the side table during dinner, Clara, it had your signature. A perfect match. But you hadn't signed a thing. She tried to forge it. She or someone they paid, but yes. The final pieces clicked into place. The timing, the lawyer, the pressure, it had all been moving faster than I realized. I'd been days away from losing everything my mother had left me. Not just the money, the house, but her trust, her legacy. I'm staying here tonight, I told Vivian. At the house, I think I need to. You won't be alone, she said gently. I'm just a few blocks away, and Clara. Yeah, don't let this harden you, but don't forget it either. I hung up and looked around the room, slowly walking from space to space, touching the edge of a bookshelf, straightening a framed photo of Mom holding me outside the bookstore, brushing dust off a windowsill that looked out onto the street. I was still standing. But for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I was bracing for the next blow. I felt like I was beginning. 2 years later, the house didn't just look different. It felt different. The kitchen had been repainted. The cabinets refitted. The leaky roof Richard insisted wasn't a priority had long been replaced with clean new shingles and a solar panel system that made my neighbors curious. But the most important changes weren't visible from the street. They lived in the silence that no longer screamed at me when I walked through the door. They lived in the walls that no longer whispered. The courtroom battle that followed the arrests took months. There were depositions, subpoenas, headlines. The trial date was pushed twice. Mr. Gaines turned state's witness before the year ended, trading testimony for a reduced sentence. Marlene received a suspended sentence after pleading guilty and cooperating, claimed Richard manipulated her, that she only signed what he told her to. Maybe that was true, or maybe she just didn't want to go down with him. Richard didn't get that option. The forgeries, the financial transfers, the email trail, it all added up to a decade of manipulation and 2 solid years of outright fraud. The last time I saw him, he was in a courthouse hallway. He didn't speak, just looked at me like I'd undone a portrait he'd spent years painting, one where he was the tragic hero, misunderstood but loving. But I hadn't ruined the picture. I just wiped off the lies. After the sentencing, the restraining order became permanent. Not just for finances, but contact. I never saw him again. But sometimes, when I walk past the room where we used to eat Sunday pancakes, I wonder what it must feel like to lose control so completely, because your daughter stopped playing along. That summer, I graduated with honors from Tulane. I stood on stage in a navy cap and gown, looking out at a crowd of strangers and a small front row of people who mattered. Vivian, Mr. Baird, a few of my professors who had become lifelines. When I spoke, I told the truth. Not about the trial or the betrayal or the press, but about trust. About how we're taught to give it easily to the people closest to us. And how sometimes protecting your peace means drawing boundaries so clearly that even blood can't blur them. After the ceremony, I visited the building I'd spent months helping renovate, the one that used to be Mom's bookstore before she sold it. Now it bore her name in gold lettering, the Monroe Literacy Center. Inside were rows of books, a cozy reading corner, and a weekly workshop I led for young women learning to manage finances, legal paperwork, and the art of saying no firmly without apology. Sometimes I saw girls who reminded me of myself, bright, cautious, eager to believe in people they loved, but with an instinct that something wasn't quite right. Those were the girls I always pulled aside after class. I'd say, protect your gut, even if it makes you look cold, even if they call you difficult. Your future is not a group project. And their eyes would light up with something I knew well. Clarity. One evening, while closing up, I found a sealed envelope under the front door. No return address, just my name in unfamiliar handwriting. Inside was a single note: I don't expect forgiveness, I just hope you used it well. There was no return address, no signature beyond the initial. I stared at the paper for a long time. I didn't cry. I didn't rage. I didn't even respond. Because closure, I'd learned, wasn't something you waited for. It was something you chose. I folded the letter, placed it in the back of a locked drawer, and left it there, not out of bitterness, but because not everything that knocks on your door deserves to be invited in. That night, I walked home alone. The streetlights flickered overhead. My keys jingled in my pocket, and for the first time in a long time, I wasn't afraid of who might be waiting on the other side of the door, because I knew who owned that home. Who earned it, who defended it, me.